Hello, this is John Majori with Majori on Bowie, and this is the Majori on Bowie YouTube channel. We're having a new interview every week that always has something to do with David Bowie. And for daily content, visit the blog, www.majorionbowie.com, where I have new content every single day that almost always has something to do with David Bowie. And while you're here, please hit like and subscribe. So today I'm very excited to have as a return guest Professor Alex Sharpe of the University at Warwick in England, who has been a previous guest on the show to talk about her book, David Bowie Outlaw. But today we're going to be talking about her new book, We're Nobody's Children, David Bowie and Existentialism. Professor Sharpe, thank you so much for joining me again today.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me back on your show.
Yeah, well, I read the book. It's very
Mm.
thought-provoking. It's very intriguing and terrific. And so let me ask you in your own words to describe what is the book about?
Okay, so the book, unsurprisingly, is perhaps about existentialism, as the
I would
title.
have never guessed.
Pardon me, yeah. So that's a particular kind of philosophy. So the book's about that. Bowie functions in two ways. One, to bring it to life, to make it accessible, which is what I tried to do with the first book. But also, I kind of make the argument that we can think about Bowie himself as having lived an existentially authentic life. Uh, that's something that I discuss.
So I'm going to ask about that, but before we get into that, who were the existentialists?
Okay, so I guess most of your viewers would probably be familiar, or some of them, I'm sure, many of them probably would be familiar with names like Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus. Many people might have read some of Camus' work doing literature at school or whatever, even. So they're really well-known kind of atheist existentialists of the war and Second World War period when existentialism kind of exploded in Paris in particular. But it actually has sort of antecedents, so we might trace it back. This might be a bit contentious for some people within philosophy, but I think we can trace it back through Heidegger in the 1920s, back through Nietzsche in the late 19th century, and as far back as Kierkegaard, who we might think of as the father of existentialism, the Danish philosopher writing in the early to mid 19th century. Although obviously some of the ideas that are talked about, we can find them even in ancient Greece, but not in this kind of worked up way that we see them presented in what is described as existentialism as a philosophical movement, or if not a movement, then at least a kind of sensibility and attitude toward life and death.
And what are some of their key ideas? And I'm particularly interested in how you link philosophers and like Camus is not necessarily a philosopher, atheists and Christians. What are the unifying ideas?
Okay, just before I respond to that, let me just say something about Camus because I'm glad you raised that. So I look at six different philosophers, and Camus is, as you say, is not really a philosopher in the way the other five are that I look at in the book. And I give reasons why I've selected Camus, which we could talk about later if you like, but just to flag that up for anybody who's potentially interested to have a look at the book more generally. Okay, so your question, John, is what are the defining characteristics of existentialism essentially?
Yeah.
Um, and I guess there are various things that not everybody agrees on, but if we think about what might be a core set of ideas that are widely shared across a number of thinkers, then they would include, I suppose most simply, we might just say existentialism is fundamentally about living an existentially authentic life, or living an authentic life. And the need to do so kind of begins with crisis. So if we take, there's always a crisis. So if we take something like Nietzsche, the crisis is the death of God. The idea that more and more people do not believe in God. And Nietzsche thought their number would grow and grow and grow going forward in time. So if we don't believe in God, and for all of those who don't, then there's a crisis, Nietzsche thinks, because God gave meaning to the world, a structure, a meaning, purpose, a point. But once God is dead and once people no longer believe in God or can't suspend their disbelief any further, then what does anything mean? What has value? And so this can create a crisis. And Nietzsche's whole project really was to kind of respond to that crisis. He wanted to avoid nihilism, where people just think, oh, anything goes, nothing matters, we can do what we want, and almost a kind of barbarism potentially could arise. Pardon me. So for Nietzsche, the whole point is to make meaning yourself. In a world with no intrinsic meaning or purpose, we must create our own. That's basically his core kind of idea. Um, Obviously, we can develop that, but we should also note that not all existentialists are atheists. So for the Christian existentialists, they also focus on a lack of meaning and a sense of alienation or estrangement. But they think the solution to that is to turn to God. So, on the one hand, we have, if you like, atheists who think God is dead, and that's a problem, or it creates a problem that we need to remedy. Whereas the Christian existentialists obviously don't think God is dead and think that leaning toward God is the way out of our despair, which they insist that we are in, whether we recognize it or not.
So I'm going to ask if you think that Bowie, there was a tension in Bowie between the two of those. But before we do that, there's something else you mentioned that is, we were having an exchange before we started talking, and you called this the elephant in the room, and I agree. Was
Okay.
Bowie authentic?
Okay,
Was
so this might seem like a problem, but I think the way of getting around this is to recognize um, authenticity might mean different things here, and people might be talking across each other. So, in one sense, Bowie is definitely inauthentic. He's inauthentic in a kind of in the sense of postmodern art or post-structuralist philosophy. The author is dead, or the artist is dead. Bowie would embrace that. There is no real us, if you like,
Yeah,
that needs to be disclosed. So in that sense, Bowie can be viewed as sort of inauthentic. And the whole idea of authenticity can be viewed as being challenged by Bowie and his artistic approach. But I think the kind of idea of authenticity that he challenges is not the kind of authenticity, it is not an idea that's defended within existentialism. So I think the problem here is to think that existentialism is defending something or articulating something against which Bowie rails. Whereas, in fact, what he's railing against might be defended in some quarters, but not within existentialism, because essentially, as Sartre pointed out, existence precedes essence, his famous line. But basically, what he meant by that was we're nothing. We're thrown into the world without rhyme or reason, and we have to make, as Nietzsche says, we have to make ourselves. And we never really arrive. We never fully complete that task, other than perhaps at the moment of death, when maybe others can retrospectively look back and work out who we were based
yeah.
on the culmination of that. So in some
So
ways, it's a false distinction to set up, I think, to think, Bowie he is authentic and he isn't authentic, but he is and he isn't depending upon the theoretical frame through which we view him. So both can
yeah,
be that they're coming from a different place and they're making a different point.
yeah.
Mm.
Uh, you said a line. You said Sartre says we're nothing, and that is, of course, also a line in Heroes. And the
Yeah.
word nothing appears over and over and over again in Bowie's lyrics. Why do you think that is? I mean, I know we can't get inside his head, but it doesn't seem like a coincidence that that word keeps popping up.
Okay. Nothing is everywhere in Bowie, as Critchley says in his Bowie book.
Yeah,
Um, I guess it's difficult to sort of put your finger on exactly what was going through Bowie's mind. I'm kind of less interested in that. I'm more interested in what we can do with these lyrics that he
yeah,
provides. So I think, like all of Bowie's work, pretty much, it's massively open to interpretation, which is part of its appeal, right? Part of its strength, and something that enables us as fans to get much more involved with because it creates a space that kind of fan creativity and participation. So the word nothing can be interpreted in lots of ways. I choose to interpret it in the book in two ways. One, that gives me a kind of platform to jump off with regard to atheist existentialism. So if we think of nothing from the point of view of Nietzsche, Heidegger, Sartre, and so on, then we might say that we're nothing. And the very fact by which, when we say we're nothing, what they all mean there is we're not anything in particular. We don't come into the world as fixed entities or essences. So we're nothing in that sense. What are we? Well, we can't really describe it. We're nothing. Um, but that nothingness is the very basis to create. There'd be no point creating if we were something in an essential way, like a rock. It is what it is. That's not what we are. So the fact that we're nothing creates the very possibility for us to grow, to develop, to invent ourselves, essentially. And that's exactly what we should do, a la Nietzsche. But another way of thinking about nothing is through the work of Simone Weil, which is a Christian philosopher that I look at in the book. And there, nothing is not so much the basis upon which to create. What, in a way, what makes creation possible is the fact that we're nothing, because we couldn't create if we were already fixed as something. But instead, we might think of nothingness or nothing here as something to move toward. So for they, I mean, we might get into this more deeply later, but she essentially thinks that we should act like God. And she sees the creation as a withdrawal, or really as a kind of originary crucifixion where God was everything. And in order for us to exist, he had to make room. So he had to make himself smaller, essentially. So the divine movement is decreation, it is lessening, it is a humility. And we can think of nothing in Bowie's lyrics in that way too. We can see Bowie in that way. So I explore Bowie both his creativity, both in terms of kind of an existential defiance in terms of the atheist, and also and also read it as a kind of getting himself out of the way in terms of Simone Weil's philosophy. I guess that, I mean, I appreciate for people who are watching the show at this point that these are quite heavy ideas and need unpacking quite a lot, and perhaps we can do that a little bit further as the interview
Yeah.
develops.
So in my mind, and you could correct me if I'm wrong here, what you're getting at is related to a tension that you alluded to earlier between whether or not a meaning is of our own creation, as you were saying, is sort of Nietzsche's point, or if it's linked to God. Um, so I was thinking right before, as I was getting ready to do this, about the song "Red Money," which is a very anxious song. We'll talk about angst. And the final line of the song is "Such responsibility is up to you and me," which I think is, we create our own meaning. But then, the cover art for your book is button eyes. And I hear Christian themes in the album Black Star, and especially the song Black Star. So I think, I think that there's a tension within Bowie's lyrics between these two visions. Am I making that up, or do you see that?
Oh, no, I see that too, and I hope the book kind of teases that out.
Yeah.
So we can think of um, the book as benchmarking Bowie, if you like, against each of these six philosophers and their different ways of thinking about what an authentic life might look like, and seeing how he stacks up against their different accounts. And he stacks up more or less against all of them, and perhaps not perfectly against any of them, as is perhaps not surprising. And in looking at it in that way, it teases out the peculiar nature of their particular accounts. To pick up on something you just said there, though, and to say something more about existentialism, we might say that it involves a choice. You talked about choice and freedom. These are important ideas. Responsibility, you said, that's a really
Yeah.
important
Yeah.
idea. So the general idea, go back to Kierkegaard, is that we kind of live aesthetic lives, which basically means um, we kind of we're kind of caught up in unreflective doing. We just do stuff unthinkingly. We do what everybody else does. We are them. We think like them. We act like them. We are them. We do, and we rarely pull away from that and think about who are we, what are our real needs, how might they be met. Um, so for all of these different people in different ways, the point that what they share, we might say, is across the religious atheist divide, is a need to make a choice amongst the available possibilities, which means letting other possibilities go. And Kierkegaard took the view that we never really did that. We kind of just kind of moved from one thing to the other, following interest, trying to avoid boredom, and kind of being spectators, if you like, within our own lives, rather than making a choice and building a life in a kind of coherent narrative way where it kind of made sense as a whole to us. Kierkegaard didn't think many people did that or do that. We just go with the flow of conventionality of fads and fashions and four-wheel drives and so on, social media
Th- th-
addiction and so on.
There's a couple phrases that appear in the book that seem to relate to one of Bowie's ongoing theme, the they or the crowd. And so what's that about? And you have multiple of the existentialists uh, rejecting the they, right? So what is that?
Yeah, I've got a bit of a cold, so I'm sorry if I'm sniffing a bit for anybody who's viewing. But okay, so we begin with Kierkegaard. He uses the term the public to capture this idea of unreflective doing. Nietzsche, more kind of in a more derogatory way, refers to it as the herd.
Yeah,
But mass existence has been used by others and so on. The they is a particular term that Martin Heidegger uses. His terminology is, a little bit inelegant. So talk about our they selves or mind self and so on. But he's when he's talking about the they, he's talking about this unreflective doing that characterizes most people in the public world. We
yeah.
don't really think about why we do stuff. We just do it because everybody does it.
I think about a group larger than three is never doing something wise or constructive in a Bowie song. And I think the song "Jump They Say," or going back to "Savior Machine," where the people call on a machine to be their savior that ultimately pleads not to give it that responsibility because its logic would destroy them, or
Yeah,
Big Brother, right? It's like the crowd is calling for Big Brother, the song Big Brother, right? And it's like I think Bowie assumes that we know that's not actually a good thing. But
yeah. I think
yeah,
Bowie. Sorry, I think Bowie was pretty much against the crowd,
yeah,
against groupthink, if you like. I mean, we've talked about this before in the context of Bowie's relationship to fascism and whether it
yeah,
was the communist experience or the German fascist experience. Um, he very much, he says at one point, doesn't he, the only person to really look to is when you look in the mirror. You've
yeah.
got to take responsibility yourself. You've
So
got to give yourself a real good stare and look hard.
yeah, so I just to close a circle on this, that is related to this concept of authenticity that we were just talking about.
Yeah, so authenticity understood in this way is about, well, I need to introduce caveats because we're talking about six different thinkers who don't share all the same things. But if we
Yeah,
just go with, let's say, go with Kierkegaard, so the first chronologically of these six, um, for him, inauthenticity, I mean, ultimately, it's living a life that's not connected to God, because that's his particular take. But in terms of what he shares with everybody else, it's just this kind of unreflective doing where we don't choose for ourselves. We have to choose. We have to think, what are our real needs? And obviously, for him, they can only be met through God. But whatever they are, we need to work out what they are and follow them and build a coherent life around them rather than not never choosing. He thinks people sit on the fence. We sit on the fence. We don't make a choice. And in failing to make a choice, we live inauthentic lives. This is kind of Kierkegaard's idea. And this is something that's taken up by all the atheists later. They jettison God from the equation, if you like. But this idea of making a choice, we can't do everything. We have to make choices. Making a choice is key.
yeah,
And responsibility comes with that. I mean, this is very Sartre. We are totally responsible for our lives. Even though we live very unequal lives, and we're thrown into the world in different ways, and some of us have more advantages than others, and so forth. But still, wherever we are, there are possibilities, and within that frame, we must choose.
Yeah. There's something else you describe that I'm going to put it in my words, and you could correct me if I'm mischaracterizing it. But there's a kind of a soil that allows for the existential exploration, and that's um, the feeling of angst. And I hadn't really thought about that before. But you have Bowie quoted as saying, if there's certain themes that I return to over and over again, I didn't have the exact quote, but it's isolation, it's angst, it's uh, dread, and so how I take from reading your book that these are feelings that as we walk through life we might try to avoid, but they're actually fertile ground for uh, well, take it from there. So what is angst, and
I
how
think
how is it useful?
I think avoiding them would be exactly what somebody like Kierkegaard would be accusing people of. That would be like the aesthetic life, to run from it
Yeah,
to some kind of numbness. Right. Okay, so different terms have been used. So somebody like Sartre used the word nausea, of course, in his famous novel Nausea. You use the word dread, which also captures something of this. I think angst, or less helpfully, anxiety could be used. I mean, anxiety's got too many kind of connections to well-being in the current sort of world in which we live, whereas I think angst kind of more better captures what they're driving at. So I'll say something about what it is in a moment, but why it's important is for these philosophers is because it kind of breaks our attachment to the they or the public or to unreflective thinking. We're stuck in there, we're just unreflectively doing stuff that they do without thinking. And then suddenly we can be pulled out of that through angst. It kind of it breaks a link, or whatever. It frees us from that, at least momentarily. And this is the moment of insight. So um, what is angst? It's a feeling of, if we could, let's compare it to other things. Let's take fear. We're all familiar with fear, aren't we? Fear, you might be afraid a dog will bite, or the bank will repossess your home, or somebody will refuse your romantic proposal, whatever it is. Um, that's always about something specific, right? Fear, like those things that I've just listed.
yeah,
But anxiety is not about, it has no object. It's not about something specific. It's about nothing, right? It's about nothing in particular. Nothing we can put our finger on. That's what the mood is that they're all trying to capture. We're all familiar with this mood coming over us, I think, where we feel at odds with ourselves and with the world. We don't really know why, but we sense it, we feel it. And this is what they're trying to capture. This is what they're referring to. And Critchley puts it really well, actually, on one of his Heidegger blog, where he says something like, in anxiety, or in angst, um, the world pulls away, he says, and we show up. Right. Whereas normally we're lost in the world, right? And then this is the moment where we suddenly start to think about, well, what choices do we have? Who can we be? How can we live? How should we live? And we then can make a choice. So the very moment the possibility of existential freedom presents itself. Now, not everybody will take that possibility. Some people will run like hell back into the crowd because the responsibility of freedom and the responsibility that comes with it are pretty frightening, right, for a lot of people. We've talked about that before in the context of German fascism. But for those who are willing to sit with the angst, there is value here for these particular philosophers, because it enables the living of an existentially authentic life, because it enables a recognition of choice and the actual making of one.
yeah. Is there a connection between this sense that is not about a specific threat and confronting death?
Okay, so I mean, death's another really important idea within philosophy generally, of course, but
Yeah,
within existentialism in particular. Not all philosophers put the same emphasis on death, though. So, I mean, Sartre didn't really, he just thought death was absurd and didn't really put quite the same emphasis on it. But Heidegger put a lot of emphasis on death. Death was absolutely critical. Facing death was critical to leading an existentially authentic life. So, To make that clearer, because people might be thinking, well, we all know we're going to die. Everybody gets that, and that's true. And Heidegger understood that. But what the point that he's making is that most people think about death as an empirical fact, something that will eventually happen sometime, someday, but not right now, not relevant to me right now. So they live in what Heidegger described as clock time, which goes on forever. So in other words, whenever their death happens, it's always going to be a tragedy because they're never going to be prepared for it because they've never really factored it into as the singular possibility of their life, right? It's the most guaranteed thing, right? Everything else is a possibility. Death is the one certainty. He felt you had to live your life with death very much in front of you, like projecting your whole life onto the horizon of your death, as he put it. Yeah. So, and also people like Simone Weil, the Christian existentialists, generally, obviously, death figures is important, right? Because within Christian theology, death assumes particular
Yeah.
relevance. But yeah, so death is important.
So that you put an image of Bowie from the Black Star period on the cover of this book, and there he was um, very aware of his mortality, but he seemed to be aware of his mortality going back as far as we know, right? So he was singing the song "My Death," which he didn't write when he was in his 20s. So
Yeah,
yeah. So but I guess let I was going to ask you a more directed question, but let me ask it in a more open-ended way. Why did you select that image to put on the cover of the book?
I think um, the main, well, I mean, apart from the fact it's a great image, I
Yeah,
think in terms of it connecting thematically, it obviously it suggests death at the end because we all recognize the image and we know the context. But it kind of links in well, particularly with sort of Kierkegaard's idea of death as there's something quite visceral about that image that um, it's frightening, right? It's
yeah,
confusing and frightening, and I think Bowie kind of conveys that through the video. He doesn't kind of like sugarcoat any of it. It's quite
right.
liquid and real, and in some ways, I think I interpret that video as kind of um, encouraging us, if you like, to foreground death and to think about our own lives because memento mori, right? It's going to happen to everyone and quicker than we all think. And I think you're right. Bowie did have death in his sights from his late teens till his death. I mean, death was a theme that runs through Bowie's interviews, Bowie's lyrics, obviously, Bowie's art. In lots of different ways, death is something he dwelt on. And
Yeah,
anxiety, I think, to go back to Angst, Bowie was
right.
anxious. He talks about that a lot. Angst was something he felt. It was definitely a theme within his art, but it was also something that his music created a mood of, right? In lots of different songs. So in that sense, he he was the crack in the sky himself to others because he helped to create in others a sense of angst, right? And having a sense of angst is important, right? As we've already discussed, because it opens up those doors, which are so crucial to help us escape from the they, if you like, and to choose our own path, whatever that might
Yeah.
be for each of us.
So I'm looking at the covers, the two covers of your two books about Bowie, and the one is from the very final period, but the earlier one is from the mid 70s and probably from 50 years ago. I think that the wearing of the crucifix is the giveaway.
Yeah.
Um, so and there's definitely connections between the David Bowie of Station to Station and the David Bowie of Black Star, but he wasn't necessarily always consistent. And I'm making this point because I want to sort of get to something else that we sort of had an exchange about before we started talking about, which is the fall. So yeah, I think you said in one email to me, "Well, we all fall," and so what were we talking about, and how is that relevant to this discussion?
Okay, so you said a number of things there, but I'll respond to the last one about the fall. So And we're not referring to the Manchester band there, I take it.
No. Another discussion.
Yeah. So the fall, I mean, when we hear that word, people are most likely to think in religious terms about, you know, the an entry into sin or whatever, the fall. That's kind of theological fall, which might be relevant to some extent because we're talking about two of these philosophers are Christians. But for the rest, the fall is not about that, but rather it's it's basically living in the they or having escaped it for a while, falling back into it. And
Yeah.
of course, we're always likely to do that because, as Heidegger says, we mostly reside in the they. Even those of us who most self-consciously try to forge our own path will be pulled back by its centrifugal force and fall. Falling is kind of like common and kind of normal. And it's almost impossible to be kind of completely free of them, if you to use Heidegger's kind of terms. But if you think of Bowie, um, and of course, the people who are listening, your audience won't necessarily agree with this. I know this all the time because I give loads of lectures, and when I talk about Let's Dance, there are many fans who love Let's Dance. I've met many people who attended the concerts to Let's Dance and had a fabulous time and love Let's Dance. So I accept that, and it's not a try to impose my view. But for me, and I think for Bowie himself, the 1980s were really an artistically poor period um, where he essentially, and he himself put it in these words, I basically started making art or music for what I thought other people wanted me to do. And because of that, the work was, artistically poor. And it was only when he got his mojo back and started doing what he wanted to do that things improved. So I think we can view, particularly "Never Let Me Down," as the kind of the zenith of the fall. Bowie really fell. It was like philosophically and artistically, it was a big fall. Yeah.
Yeah. I, at the risk of getting sidetracked, he also uses imagery of falling or descent and ascent, right? Even that song, "Never Let Me Down," right? It's that the term "let down" appears in his songs over and over again. So maybe this was in the back of his mind, but he surely was aware of a lot of what you're writing about. He read existential philosophers, and this isn't a coincidence that you're using David Bowie to describe some of what these different philosophers were getting at.
No, no. So, I mean, just to pick up on your first point, and I'll come back to the second one.
Yeah.
You talked about examples of falling, and obviously we can think of the man who fell to earth in this,
Yes. Yeah.
but also that Bruegel picture where the little man's falling in the corner, and Bowie talks about that as well. So I think he was very savvy to that and thought about that, and it came through in his art in different ways. But remind me what I just wanted to touch on that, but your bigger point that you were trying to steer me toward was.
Well, then it's not a coincidence, right? I mean, Bowie was conscious. So even using language of dissent was something that he was probably, we're probably supposed to find meaning in that. It's not just "never let me down." Is It's a phrase, but he uses the phrase "let down" or some variation of it over and over again. You
Yeah.
mentioned uh, Bruegel's painting. It's the fall of Icarus, right? And that he actually specifically references that painting by name in the song "Goodbye, Mr. Ed," which is a Tin Machine song. And just if you don't know the painting, he says Icarus takes his pratfall. But I'm going off on a tangent now, so we. But one of the things that I think is like I learned about that painting from David Bowie, and one of the things that um, I took from his reference is, as you just said, the figure of Icarus is off in the corner. You could miss it, right? And I take it that it's like nobody really cares, but that's yeah. Go
Well, and
ahead.
it's what we miss, right, as well, more generally,
Yeah,
that we tend to miss some really important stuff when we look.
yeah,
Is a theme there as well.
yeah. So let me. I apologize because I went off on a tangent, but let me get back to this. The existentialists are seem to me to be advocating a very engaged way of living, and what you're describing as the potential to sort of fall into the they or to fall into just going along with the crowd, that's sort of the easy way out. Or if you're using the Bowie's 80s period as an analogy, he was doing what people wanted, right? That was kind of an easy thing to do.
Yeah, it's kind of easy in one way and then hard in the sense that it's the death of a thousand cuts sort of it. But yeah, it's easy in that obvious way. That's right.
Yeah. So this is my question, which I really don't understand. Are the existential are they might not all be on the same page, but in generally, are they advocating a way to walk through life, or are they making an observation about how people walk through life?
No, no, they're advocating the living of an authentic life, but you have to kind of work that out for yourself. So they're not telling you how you should live in some kind of detail.
Yeah.
So and they're doing it in different ways. So sort of like somebody like Kierkegaard is very much about inwardness. We have to pull away from the crowd and look inside ourselves, where we can find what our real needs are, which of course for him are a personal relationship with God. Um, but it's not, yeah, it's not abstract in that sense. It's they do want you to think about your life in a deeper way and make some choices. But what those choices are have to be yours. So in that sense, both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are quite like Socratic in that sense. And that's why the way that they write is full of parables and allusions, and it's indirect writing. So you never really know where they stand. So you can't just
Yeah.
follow. And that's deliberate because they don't want followers. Nietzsche said they don't want followers. He only wants
Yeah.
creatives. He wants people that will create, not people that will follow. That's the last thing he wants. So he makes it difficult. So you're forced to make your own choice because you can't follow, because you can't work out exactly what the writer, where he or she stands. So you can't simply follow them because that's not possible and that's deliberate. And that's very Bowie-esque, isn't it?
Yes.
Because,
Yes.
right.
No, no, keep going. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, well, but very Bowie-esque in the sense that he writes in a way that opens itself up to massive amounts of interpretation, which was something he did quite deliberately,
Yeah.
and he made that point in many interviews.
Right. Yeah. That's one of the largest takeaways I get. I think he's an unreliable interpreter of his own lyrics. And sometimes I think when he's pressed to explain something, I almost get the feeling he's trying to pull our legs, right? He's like he doesn't want to tell us what to think about his own lyrics. And that seems like it's very much consistent with what you're just saying.
Yeah, and I don't think Bowie necessarily has a particular take anyway.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. Uh, the different philosophers that you write about, they're not all in agreement with one another. Um, how is Bowie different than the philosophers that you touch upon?
Okay, so Bowie shares quite a lot with each of these philosophers, shares more with some than others. So if we compare him to Nietzsche, for example, and of course, people sure will be aware that Nietzsche is a figure that does figure in Bowie's lyrics, and he read some Nietzsche and so on. So probably more obvious sort of philosophical influence on Bowie than some of the other philosophers that I look at. But he was kind of more humble than Nietzsche, I think, in terms. I mean,
Mm,
Nietzsche kind of thought you had to kind of become a law unto yourself, whereas I think Bowie kind of found that that was somewhat hubristic, especially late in his later work and life. And I think again, this is connected to the fact that Bowie was deeply spiritual and never really let go of the sort of Godhead. If we look at somebody like Camus, I mean, Bowie had a lot of time for Camus in lots of ways, but the difference between Camus and the others is that most of these philosophers think we feel estranged in the world. But the reason we feel estranged, well, Christians think we feel that because we've lost touch with God. But the atheists think that we feel this estrangement because we are lost in the they. And if we can just become authentic, we won't feel estranged. Whereas Camus thinks we will always feel estranged no matter what we do, because that's the basic condition of being human. Um, So I think Bowie was kind of a little bit caught between that kind of Camus view and the kind of Sartre or Heidegger view. But I think on the whole, looking at his work as a whole over his lifetime, he was more hopeful than Camus, I think, in that sense. And he was a little bit more invested in the idea that we can transcend our inherited situation rather than that we are doomed and embrace the doom is what we should do. So Camus was a bit more closer to Beckett, but he wasn't as bad as Beckett because Beckett, of course, said there's nothing to be done, whereas Camus definitely thought there was something to be done, which we see through his ideas of love and solidarity that come through in the Revels. So yeah, there are those kind of differences and similarities. And if we take the most tricky one of all, well, obviously Bowie was less certain about God than Kierkegaard and Wey, although he didn't really give up on that. If we take Heidegger, I think he's the most tricky one to talk about. So Heidegger had a really quite complex sort of philosophical take. So he was interested in being. What does it mean to be? The Shakespearean question, to be or not to be. Yeah. And for Heidegger, like Nietzsche, to really be was he talked about language as being the house of being, particularly poetry. We might think of culture more generally here. And what he meant by that was that we kind of make sense of who we are through culture, through language. And we need to therefore draw on the best of it. And for him, like Nietzsche, the best of it was pre-Socratic Greece. Obviously, that's contentious. We don't all necessarily agree that that should be how we view things, but that's how they viewed it. And so, of course, they didn't want to go back to Greece. They weren't romantics. They wanted to go forward, right? But they wanted to look back, take the best of what they could find, and then use it to propel us into the future in a kind of authentic living. The problem that creates for Bowie is that, as we all know, Bowie was incredibly eclectic. He drew on everything. He was a bit of a magpie. He drew on cultures of all sorts, both spatially and temporally through time. So, I mean, Japan, for example, right? He was very interested in Japan. Yeah, so Bowie drew on, say, Japan and other things. So this is a real problem for Heidegger because you can't the whole being for him is kind of just something that happens within the culture. You can't go outside the culture. This is not a discovery of being. This is some kind of perversion or distraction from what it means to be because we are within our own cultures. Okay, obviously that's problematic, but if we take Heidegger's idea seriously, Bowie doesn't really fit perfectly there. And also, Heidegger took the view that he had a problem with modern art or avant-garde art. He's because not because it was degenerate, so it wasn't just that kind of well, obviously he was a member of the Nazi Party briefly, but I don't think it was because of that kind of view of degeneracy so much, but more the idea that modern art is about aesthetics, it's about form and beauty. Whereas Heidegger thought, he said something like, in aesthetics, art dies. Because for him, art is about a relationship with the people, whereby artists, it's kind of almost like art is being or art is history, in the sense that history is really about interpretation and ongoing interpretation, an endless, vital culture that just keeps going. And this begins in art for Heidegger. But so art needs to both do two things. One, good art, not the modern art that he loathed, but good art discloses a world that we don't normally see. That's the first thing. But it does it in a way in which mystery is retained. So therefore interpretation remains possible. Whereas he accused Picasso, for example, of presenting art forms that revealed everything. And so they were like stillbirths in terms of driving culture forward. Um, so obviously Bowie drew on modern art as well as postmodern art. I mean, Bowie drew on a whole lot of things, but he did draw on modern art, Duchamp and so on. And so he could be criticized. Also, Bowie's own art, right? If we think about all his paintings, his neo-expressionist paintings, particularly in the 1990s, I mean, he go back further, but he started to exhibit in the 90s, didn't he? And in a way, we might think of Bowie as a kind of lesser figure, maybe, within the neo-expressionist movement, of which, more famous people like Haring and Basquiat and so forth. In some ways, I think that art is less of a problem for, I mean, obviously that Heidegger died before that art, neo-expressionism had its day, but in some ways it's not really like the kind of abstraction of modern art. It's figurative, if distorted.
Hmm.
Um, on the other hand, it's quite passionate, so that potentially could be a problem. But um, yeah, so where exactly Bowie's art would fall within a sort of Heideggerian understanding of being is more debatable. But it's definitely not the case that we can sort of say that Bowie fits easily into Heidegger because there are at least two caveats there that make it a bit more tricky, I think, to describe Bowie, and particularly in terms of his art, as authentic in that sense. But that doesn't mean he's not authentic because we don't have to accept these Heideggerian caveats or approach existentialism through Heidegger even because we could go through Sartre or we could look at Camus or we could look at Simone Weil and think about Bowie's spirituality.
Yeah. So he's not in perfect alignment with any of the philosophers that you mentioned. Is he a philosopher?
Well, first of all, he's not in perfect alignment with any of them. They're not in perfect alignment with each other, so it's hardly
Right.
surprising.
Yeah.
Is he a philosopher? And this is something I think we touched on in the previous interview. He's obviously not a philosopher in the sense that, he doesn't write philosophical texts according to philosophical protocols and publish in philosophical journals and so on and so forth. But he might be viewed as a philosopher in the sense of the core sense, the kind of Socratic sense of what it means to do philosophy, which is really arguably a meditation on death.
Mm. Yeah.
So because he spent his whole life thinking about death, which is why he connects really well with Heidegger, rather than Sartre, because I think there's a quote, isn't there? I mentioned it in the book. I'm just reminding myself in the chapter on my death, the final chapter. There's a quote at the top from Bowie himself. This you could ask this: is this David Bowie or Martin Heidegger? It could just as easily be either. But the quote is that period of time from today until my demise is the only thing that fascinates me. This is David
Yeah.
Bowie. A demise there is really important because that's a sort of term of art that Heidegger uses to distinguish from perishing. For Heidegger, perishing doesn't, he's not interested in perishing. We all perish. We become corpses. That wasn't what Heidegger was interested in. He was interested in our demise, by which he meant he was referring to the fact that we stop making meaning. And it's the demise that matters because he sees us as caught up in language. It's the house of being. We're dead when we when we no longer make meaning.
Yeah. Well, Bowie avoided that, right? I mean, with Black Star and Lazarus, there was not a lot of distance between the debut of Lazarus and his own death. So he
No,
never
no.
stopped making meaning.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
yeah. So, I think that covers the book, and I would encourage anybody to get it because if you like this discussion, the book is it's very engaging and very thought provoking. But I'm going to hit you with a question I didn't tell you I was going to ask. Um, we're not talking about the writings of David Bowie like he's writing philosophy or some insight from understanding the psychology. We're drawing this all from the lyrics of his songs, some of his imagery, right?
Yeah. Well, all of his work. So yes, obviously his songs, his lyrics, but his interviews
Hmm.
puts across the artist and or the artistic expression and the man himself. Mm.
Yeah, but
Like,
sticking with the songs, the question is, would you highlight some of the songs that stand out to you as particularly existentialist?
um, well, I think there's quite a lot of songs that I mean, I see David Bowie's life and work as a whole in
Yeah,
terms of a kind of existential dread and a kind of how should we say a kind of plumbing of the human condition. So
yeah,
in the most generic sense, we might say that the whole 50 years was that, and that's expressed in all kinds of different ways as he explored it in so many different ways. So I suppose we might think that Bowie is existentialist or authentically so because he kind of his life was. We might not think of Bowie as coherent because we think he's this, that, he's everything, he's about change and so on. But the one thing that isn't change with Bowie, or the thing that's consistent, is that he explored the human condition again, again and again for 50 years and tried to make sense of himself and the world around it. So in that sense, he's very like an existentialist philosopher. There is a real core to what he's about. And it's easy to miss that by just focusing on the more superficial stuff. It's better, I think, to focus on the man rather than reduce him to his artistic devices.
Yeah. Well,
Mm.
beautiful. Well, Professor Sharp, this has been wonderful. I want to close by asking a little bit of a more frivolous question, which I asked you the last time. But we all, whenever I ask this, you know, there's an assumption that the answer is not always the same, which is what is your favorite Bowie song and album these days?
Well, I won't give the same answers. It is very difficult, isn't it? There's so many songs I like. I like the song My Death, which of course is not a Bowie song, but it is a song Bowie covered and everybody will be familiar with, I'm sure, who's listening or watching. I think that's a fantastic song, and one that's probably quite appropriate here in the context of these conversations. Um, I don't know. Let's go with Heroes, which I think is probably seems to be everybody's favorite song. But again, it's a song that has the word nothing in,
Yes.
something we've talked about a lot today in
Yeah.
so existentialism. So I'll go with those two today.
Beautiful. Professor Alex Sharpe, thank you so much. Thank you for the book. Thank you for joining me again. And I hope we talk again soon.
Yeah. Thank you, and me too. Hope we do talk again soon. Although I don't have any immediate plans for a Bowie trilogy, but who knows?
There's a lot of time.
Another time, yeah.
All right. Thank you.